All righty, man. There's nothing like getting started with the International and then Dr. King. I'm joined today by a good comrade Shabbir Rizvi, who's a political analyst and anti-imperialist organizer specializing in geopolitical developments and U.S. foreign politics. He's someone who I've been hoping to have on the show for a very long time. We've been publishing his work for quite a while. So thank you so much for coming on, Comrade Shabbir.
Thank you for having me, comrade.
So, the first question I wanted to ask you, the economist Michael Hudson views the current genocidal war on Palestine as the U.S.'s opening of a third front against Iran, one of the countries our empire considers to be part of the triad of evil, along with, of course, Russia and China. Iran, of course, is almost always in the Western mainstream media news, hanging around like a sort of boogeyman in the discussion of Palestinian resistance. Is it correct to say that the war on Palestine is, at least in part, a component of a larger imperialist push against Iran?
I would say absolutely. I mean, let's talk about it from day one. Day one of Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979. Day one, Ayatollah Khomeini issued a statement that said that we will always back Palestine and that we will never recognize the Israeli state, and that one of the main components of the Islamic Revolution in Iran is to get rid of this colonial entity known as Israel and all other colonial entities in the region as well. So right from the get-go, you know that Iran won't stand for Israel. Israel will not stand for Iran. Now, in the context of what Michael Hudson is saying, um, one, Iran has throughout the years experienced horrific sanctions, horrific attempts to, undermine its processes, undermine its economy, overthrow its leaders, and within that, it's been self-sufficient and hasn't really relied on other countries at all for its development. This has led to Iran kind of cultivating its own economy, creating its own economic ties based on, its own kind of demands. As we see, kind of, its strengthening partnership with Russia, with China, with its entry into BRICS, with its entry into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And so, what we see now is that Iran stands as this economic powerhouse, of developing economic powerhouse, but more so, it's become what we call a regional power. Now, the United States, as it tries to grow its hegemonic power, is definitely looking into obviously throwing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars into Israel. I always call Israel the 51st state. Israel is kind of the gateway for the United States into the region. And if you recall Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech at the United Nations General Assembly just a few months ago, he had a map of what he called the new Middle East. By the way, Palestine was completely erased. He just had Israel on it. And he talked about specifically the Abraham Accords, and he talked about specifically trade routes. And now what that means is the only way that this state, this illegitimate state of Israel, is planning to sustain itself right now is through basically U.S. economic intervention. But in order for it to justify itself, it needs to be able to expand and play in harmony with the other states in the region. Now, we have some states, like, for example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that capitulated to Israel, right? They, turned their backs on the Palestinian cause and they capitulated to Israel. But then you have some states that stand as a literal physical blockade to Israel. And so it's not a matter of fact that, they're going to want war with Iran. It's the fact that this war is ongoing. It's happening right now. And the fact of the matter is the war is not between just Israel and Iran or America and Iran. It's about the complete global imperial system versus the global majority, what we would call the global south. So yes, I would definitely agree with what Michael Hudson would have to say there.
That's such an important component, brother, because uh, there's a lot of our friends who have been extremely critical of the Zionist project, who are critical of the genocide that Israel is waging with uh, U.S. funding and equipping on the people of Gaza, but who don't have the systematic analysis because they're not rooted in the Marxist tradition that can clearly see how the imperialist system is bound to produce catastrophes. as the one we're seeing right now waged on the Palestinian people. I wanted to move to another section of the discussion on Iran. Cuban President Diaz-Canel recently visited Iran, where he met with President Ibrahim Raisi and the Ayatollah Khamenei. What was the purpose of this visit? What agreements were reached between the two countries, and how have the relationships between Cuba and Iran developed in the last few years?
Yes, definitely an interesting thing to analyze, especially right now. Because if you look at the history of both countries, one, they started off by overthrowing a US backed dictator that essentially was a comprador. It was a comprador regime. And throughout the years, of course, they enjoyed warm relations, but not so much as warm as they enjoy today. You know, there's numerous pictures you can find of Fidel Castro meeting with Ayatollah Khomeini. There's numerous pictures of him meeting with various Iranian presidents. But right now, I think we're going to see an increase in relations, particularly between the Raisi administration and Diaz-Canel's administration. But why now? Why is that so important, right? Well, let's actually take a look. Let's take it a few steps back. A lot of people, a lot of critics of, let's say, anti-imperialist countries, always criticize that these countries, invest so much into military, invest so much into weapons, invest so much into arms and things like that. Why don't they focus on their people? Now, we both know that that's a liberal take. It's not a very rooted in science take, right? So let's actually play this out, right? Let's say Iran and Cuba try to enjoy warm economic relations as they do now, let's say 10 years ago. Let's say Iran sends a fleet of much needed, let's say Iran sends like multiple, ships of much needed resources to Cuba, right? It has oil, it has, pharmaceutical stuff, it has, just basic technology that, Cubans can't take for granted, right? What happens the moment that they leave the Red Sea? Boom, you're going to have the United States Navy all over you. They're going to be stealing your ship. In fact, right now, as I'm speaking, there is a stolen Iranian goods off the Gulf of Mexico. Basically, the oil barons of the United States are considering taking it. But the one thing that now stands in its way, and this is exactly what I'm getting to, is that Iran now has a navy that's capable of actually protecting its goods, that's able to sail across the world. In May of this year, I believe it was the 82nd or the 86th Fleet of the Iranian Navy, completed a worldwide flotilla, went all across the world, therefore proving that it has the ability to navigate from one part of Earth to the other back unharmed. Now, what does that add to the equation? That basically is a huge security guarantee. Cuba can send Iran millions of dollars to say, hey, can you send us this? But if there's no security guarantees, that is a bad investment. That is a terrible investment. And so what Iran has done is that slowly but surely has beefed up its navy, has beefed up its air force, as we just saw, actually just wrote about this a few days ago, the purchase of Russian Su-35s, which is a game changer for the region. And now what Iran can do is say, hey, Cuba, we're actually going to trade with you. We're going to trade with Nicaragua. We're going to trade with Venezuela. And there's nothing the United States can do about it unless it wants to get smoked in its own waters. There you go. And so what we're seeing in this new, what we call multipolar world, is the ability for these countries that have been so ruthlessly sanctioned, so ruthlessly strangled by the United States, that have been blatantly, raided by the United States. There are millions of dollars worth of stuff stolen. Now we're seeing that equation beginning to kind of change. Now we have security guarantees. Now we have different countries being able to actually trade very openly. And let's talk about this too, right? Cuba is completely isolated, mostly by the West, right? Every year we see the UN vote where the entire world says, hey, let's unblock Cuba, and the United States and Israel say no, and the Ukrainian government, because they're ran by a bunch of spineless cowards, abstain. And so what happens then? The United States basically has complete domination over the West. The West is where all the pharmaceuticals lie, or the West is where all the technology rights lie. The West is where everything that actually needs a patent lies, until now. Because now countries like Iran that have maintained self-sufficiency for so long, and Cuba that has maintained self-sufficiency for so long, but could not trade because of the peril at sea, are now able to trade. And so what we're going to see, not only just now, but even in the months to come, actually started this spring when President Raisi did a 3-country tour of Latin America. He went to Cuba, he went to Venezuela, and he went to Nicaragua. Now we're going to see more established relations between countries within the global south, which to the not well versed reader would be like, well, why don't these people just trade together? Now they can actually trade together and actually have the security guarantees needed in order for both of their economies to thrive.
That's such an important point, brother, because we've seen it, with the shipments to Venezuela, where the U.S. just like pirates, it's like modern day pirates. They just take it and then give it to their oil barons. Yeah, and that development, the role of developing the securities of a country, the ability to protect itself militarily against the forces of imperialism is so important. That's why Zhao Enlai, when he uh, lays out the four modernizations that end up becoming a central focus of the reform and opening up period in China, besides the forces of production, besides science and technology, besides agriculture, you have the defenses, defenses of a country, so that these securities can be put in place and allow for fruitful trade amongst folks in the anti-imperialist camp. Um, the next question I wanted to ask you is that I think it becomes clear to anyone who can see two fingers in front of their face that we're witnessing the rise of a new post-hegemonic, multipolar, if we're with Chavez, pluripolar world, but one that is also quite ideologically heterogeneous. What role do you think these ideologically diverse nations, such as Iran, Cuba, Russia, China, Venezuela, play in helping to usher in a new world order?
I think Xi Jinping said this best. I'm going to completely butcher this quote. But he said that true democracy is the ability of people to be able to practice their own form of democracy and what they deem is right and what they deem is culturally valuable. And what I think this ushers in is basically the acceptance that uh, you don't have to practice Western liberalism in order to be considered a democracy. Democracy is what the majority of people within a state agree to what they want to be governed by, agree to the cultural norms that they want to be governed by. It might be unpopular with another state, a certain cultural or political practice, but if one state likes it, then that's totally fine. Here's a great example of that. Let's actually go back to Iran and let's go back to Cuba, right? Many people kind of write off the Iranian Revolution because it was considered anti-Marxist. In my opinion, the Iranian people just had a bad tent with Marxism because the majority of Marxists during the revolution were Trots, and then of course there was one of the mistakes that we have to be critical of the Soviet Union for was arming Saddam to bomb Iran, which is ultimately why Iran did not like the communists or did not like Marxism, quote unquote. Although a lot of policies within its specific economies could be attributed to socialist policies, but that's a whole other thing of its own, right? So just knowing that kind of background and context and cultural take on Marxism from certain Iranians, why would they do business with communist Cuba? Why would they do business with communist Venezuela? Why would they do business with communist China? It doesn't make sense, right? Well, that's actually where you have it completely wrong. What we're seeing is, the global unifier here is the ability to be sovereign, the ability to do what you feel is right for your nation. And as long as another nation isn't infringing on said rights, we can totally work together. This is completely contrary to the Western dominated neoliberalism that we see today, where if you don't have this and that in your voting booth, and if you don't have such and such as delivers, and if you don't have this and that, private corporations, looking at you throughout all hours of the day and this and that surveillance state, then you're not, considered a true democracy, right? And that's the kind of like the Western way. It's a really, childish way that I just really put it. But what I'm trying to say is essentially that, the world doesn't need to abide by, the definition of democracy that the West has made for itself, while, maintaining this authoritarian rule over its own people. And so with this emerging new world order, we're going to see a lot of different ways that what we call democracy, be practiced as. And I think one thing that, we as Marxists have to keep in mind is that we have to be kind of open-minded about the way different states practice what they call democracy, because it all relates down to what the people's struggle there is and their kind of relationship to the state, their relationship to, the people's relationship to the means of production, the people's relationship to imperialism, and how they go about conveying that and how they go about navigating that.
100%. I couldn't possibly agree with you more. Here at the Institute, we're uh, very big critics of what we call the purity fetish. You know, this idea that's prevalent in the Western left that if something doesn't measure up to the pure idea I have of it in my head, I'm going to condemn it. And you find that to be the case very much so with not just socialist countries existing outside of the sphere of influence of empire, but not explicitly socialist or not explicitly communist countries that are playing a historically progressive role in the fight that they're waging against a currently US led imperialism. I wanted to switch to our next question, which requires me to pull up quite a few different things. The first one is a study that confirms from UNICEF that Israel has killed nearly 9,000 children, and I think a lot of these numbers are quite low, you know. But when you see the numbers of deaths being brought into question by mainstream media, it's usually because they're doing some BS tactic, like, well, it comes from the Hamas health institutions who are telling us, you know, how many people have died. In reality, there's tens of thousands of people under the rubble that haven't been found yet and therefore cannot yet be confirmed dead. So whenever you see even these numbers, it is likely that it's a lot less. But in conjunction with that, just to set the table for the next couple of comments, recently Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin said the following. Let's play this and then I have one more clip to show before I ask you the question.
This kind of a fight, the center of gravity is the civilian population. And if you drive them into the arms of the enemy, you replace a tactical victory with a strategic defeat. So I have repeatedly made clear to Israel's leaders that protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza is both a moral responsibility and a strategic imperative.
So there's the U.S. empire speaking in terms in which it wasn't, you know, almost 60 days ago, describing the potential or the actuality of a strategic defeat that could be had by Israel. And then this came out, I believe, today. This is UN National Security Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter to urge the Security Council to force a ceasefire on Israelis' genocidal war in Gaza. So, Comrade Shabbir, what I wanted to ask you is, basically, it's extremely clear that the vast majority of the world, those not included when the U.S. and its lackeys speak about the international community, which we know it's reduced to the 14% of the world that colonized the rest of the planet, but the vast majority of the global South and the vast majority of the citizens within the global North itself, within the heart of the empire in our country, the vast majority of people are in favor of a ceasefire. And the vast majority of the world is in favor of even more than a ceasefire, is in favor of an end to the occupation and the apartheid state of Israel as it currently exists. So, how do you see this playing out? How long can the genocidal war against the Palestinians last in the face of such global condemnation and such clear defeat in the information war?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that a lot of people are asking. Let me actually start off by talking about the UN Charter or whatever resolution they passed. You can invoke the Charter and you can pass the resolution. Israel has broken over 65 resolutions since its inception. So, you know, if you can pass the resolution, that's great. But are they going to abide by that? Probably not. Let's talk about a ceasefire. Sure, we can have a ceasefire. And, you know, I agree with the ceasefire. I agree with, you know, the stoppage of the Israeli bombs, or rather the U.S.-made bombs dropped by Israel. Drop it. You know, obviously stopping from bombing the Gaza Strip. But I think more importantly, what it comes down to is those bombs are going to stop dropping again, right? They're going to continue dropping. The occupation doesn't end there. The siege of Gaza doesn't end there. You know, even before the war started, Gaza didn't even have like pure water. Most of its water was contaminated. Very few materials are allowed into the strip. They don't get construction materials. They don't even get basic medicine in order to, you know, get life-saving surgery for even having cancer. It's a months-long process, and oftentimes at the end of that months-long process, you're denied from even leaving, right? So what it comes down to is, sure, you can have your ceasefire, you can have your temporary ceasefire or whatever you want to call it. But the fact of the matter is it's an ongoing genocide. And the only way you're going to solve that equation is by the complete dissolution of the occupation. There's no other way around it. There's no other way that this equation can be solved. The fact of the matter is that Israel is a very, very expensive investment, and there's no return on investment. Let's actually look at it from the aspect of the bourgeoisie. Let's put our best capitalist hat on and think about this. We are pouring billions of dollars into our 51st state. And what does our 51st state do? It's a PR catastrophe. There's no products being delivered. We have to constantly make excuses for it. Meanwhile, they're killing kids. They're making up stories. So their PR department is trash because they can't even make up a good lie. A literal state that's built on lies cannot do the one thing that it was built on, and that's lie. It's even failing at that. And so what does that mean? One, there's no other way. You have to cut. Eventually, the United States is eventually going to have to cut off, its military aid or do something. It's going to be either publicly pressured or just not going to see a return on investment. It's going to hold on until its last breath. But rest assured, they will have to let go of this. Two, the only way that this really ends, the only way, like I said, this really ends is the victory of the Palestinian people over the Zionist occupation. There is no other way that will permanently solve this other than the defeat of Israel. And what's going to happen now, in at least the short term, and that's three, there's no other way to look at it. Israel's going to lose this. Why? Because if the entire world is telling them to have a ceasefire, for example, right? They already laid out their plans. They already laid out their strategic objectives. They want to wipe out Hamas. So what does a ceasefire mean? The world is pressuring Israel to lose is the way that they're looking at it. And they're going to have no choice but to toss the glove. Because what's happening right now, as I'm speaking and getting notifications of the latest Al Qassam video hitting the internet with these guys just walking up the tanks and blowing the living shit out of them. Dude, you cannot win against these people that are so committed to the liberation of their homeland. Meanwhile, you have a diaper army that runs away at the slightest, knock on a door. You cannot win this. You cannot beat the Palestinian people. And no charter is going to save the Palestinian people. No outside intervention is going to save the Palestinian people, because it's going to be the Palestinian people that heroically tell the world that this is how you deal with occupation. This is going to set off a chain reaction of anyone else that is currently under any U.S. or otherwise other imperialist occupation, and shit's going to get real. And that's what I think we can expect in not only the coming years, but the coming days.
Beautifully said, brother. That's how Algeria liberated itself. That's how the Irish liberated themselves. That's how many of the other great anti-colonial revolutions liberated themselves. And I think you couldn't be more right. Israel is, as we've been talking about it, a colonial outpost for American imperialism in the region, and it's been bearing very little fruit besides PR catastrophes, and it hasn't been able to achieve any of the objectives, or a good number of the objectives that it exists for, and all it brings is more a rather radical intensification of the delegitimation of the imperialist system that Israel is very evidently one of the key components of. Brother, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. We're going to have to bring you back on soon. Is there anything you'd like to plug before we send you on your way?
Yeah, I got two things for your audience. So whether you prefer Twitter or Instagram, get on that right now. I'm going to give you two things. So one, you're going to type in March on RNC 2024, because them, all that shit's happening. So that's March on RNC 2024, Twitter or Instagram, or sorry, X or Instagram. And then two, just because we love to give equal love, you're going to type in March on DNC 2024. That's on Instagram and Twitter. March on DNC. So if you hate one more than the other, great. Follow both. See what's up.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a duopoly. They both serve the same master. So screw them both. They don't serve us. They serve our enemy. The ruling class. Thank you so much for coming on, brother. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'll see you soon.